Good afternoon, everyone. Just checking that all of the main parties are back. It's now 2:30 and I shall resume the inquiry. Just to confirm that all parties have received the appellant's rebuttal of the new evidence suggested by Peter Mitchell.
Yep.
Yes, thank you, ma'am.
And has everyone had time to digest that evidence, that rebuttal?
The evidence, but not my lunch, unfortunately. Thank you, ma'am.
Well, if you're happy to proceed with a little bit of indigestion, then would you like to commence the evidence in chief with Mr. Mitchell, please?
Yes, thank you, ma'am. If I could ask Mr. Mitchell to turn his camera and microphone on, please.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes, Mr. Mitchell. Welcome to the inquiry.
Thank you.
Mr. Mitchell, if I could introduce you, please, from your proof of evidence. And it starts on page 9 of 54 of that document. You are Peter Mitchell, that's right?
I am indeed.
And you've worked in bereavement services for more than 38 years at all levels, from operations to management in both public and private sector cemeteries and crematoria for 19 years.
Yes.
And you state that you manage 2 public sector and 2 private sector crematoria in different parts of the UK between 86 and 2002. And that in addition to your full-time employment, you were both the law tutor and technical officer for the Institute of Burial and Cremation Administration, now the ICCM, the Institute of Cemetery and Cremation Management.
Yes.
Thank you. And you are a fellow of the ICCM, having been elected as such in 2001.
Yes.
Thank you. Finally, you tell us that you started your own consultancy in April 2002. You've worked on an extensive range of projects, including needs assessment reports in support of planning applications and planning appeals for both new crematoria and cemeteries, and you've appeared as an expert witness on need at various planning inquiries.
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I would like first, because there's a lot of technical language to get one's head around with the needs assessment of crematoria, just if you could set out some of the key components in assessing need. So we will hear, no doubt, through evidence about 30 and 45-minute drive time catchment areas. Please briefly just explain what they are and why they are important, please.
Yes, indeed. I would like to reiterate that we mustn't lose sight of the fact, with all these numbers flying around, that we're talking about people, and in particular bereaved people. In recent years, it's become quite common to assess the quantitative need for crematoria by looking at the population within a reasonable drive time of the crematorium. And there have been thresholds. If you've got this number of people living then in your catchment, then yes, you've got a viable crematorium. And in recent years of planning appeals, it's been recognised that a 30-minute drive time at cortege speed, 60% slower than normal traffic would make the journey, that has been regarded as an important measure, an important threshold of need. And 45 minutes reflects the fact that there's quite a few areas where there isn't a crematorium within 30 minutes, but there might be one within 45 minutes. And then in addition to those drive time catchments, there are 2 others called the minimum drive time catchment or the natural catchment area. And what they're all about is, wherever I am, where is my nearest crematorium? And it's identifying the full catchment area of each crematorium until it bumps into the full catchment area of another one. So there's a series of these drive time catchments. There's lots of different software that people use to come up with results. So it's a widely used and useful tool. I think it should be seen as that. It cannot explain human behaviour, but it essentially works on the basis that a lot of the time, most people will choose to go to a crematorium that's closest to them or where the deceased lived.
Thank you. Next, for our growing glossary, you deal with, and indeed as does Mr. Best and Mr. Hodgson, with cremation rates. I think that's fairly self-explanatory. It's the rate at which the number of deaths translate into a cremation. There is a difference between you and Mr. Best about whether cremation rates should be set at 80 or 85%. What is the difference between you and why is it there, please?
In my an early section of my need report, I got some pretty graphs showing the growth of cremation since 1885, and it's very evident indeed that the proportion of the proportion of deaths that result in a cremation has increased significantly. In 1885, there was only one cremation funeral. So the proportion of cremations has increased, and there has been a huge increase. And you put the development of crematoria and the growth of cremation together, and you can see they follow each other. If you build a crematorium, it encourages cremation. And so we now have 311 or possibly more, because there's quite a few being built, crematoria serving the UK. The rates vary. You've got sort of you've got a UK average rate, you've got a rate for Scotland, England and Wales, and the general rate in the last year or so, if we ignore COVID, in England, on average, it's about 80%. And as I say, there can be regional variation in this. And it has been growing, and I've got the graphs in my need report to show it's grown. However, mitigating against this, what might be described as relentless growth, there are also other factors. There are two main ones that I've identified. One is the growth in the Muslim population, and I've done some work. I've worked for a number of different Muslim groups and become familiar with their requirements. And one of them is very much for burial only, and not cremation. And I've done work that's shown me that as time passes, the Muslim population is not only growing through giving birth to children, that it's a relatively young age structure, and as time passes they will increasingly have more and more older people. Statistically, the older you get, the greater the chance of dying, and that Muslims, because they have a younger age structure, I'm convinced that they do not account for the same proportion of deaths within their community as in other communities, that as they age, the proportion of their deaths will be similar to generally, and therefore there's going to be a lot more Muslim deaths which require burial. So I think that will have a mitigating impact upon the continued rise, just rise of the cremation rate. You've also got, partly through environmental awareness, you've got another sector in society who are electing for natural burial. I can't get any data on, well, how many people are being buried in green burial sites. But I know that similarly to crematoria, there's been a very rapid growth from the first one in 1993. And I think that concerns about the environment, even with the abatement plant that's fitted to most cremators these days, people are still going to prefer to go for the natural burial option. And then you've got other groups who want to be buried you've got, amongst the Jewish community, you've got the more liberal Jews that will accept cremation, but Orthodox Jews definitely want burial. Roman Catholics, in spite of the Pope saying cremation's okay back in 1962, I think it was, a lot of Roman Catholics will prefer burial, and they always will prefer burial. So I don't think we're ever going to get to 100% cremation rate. I'm confident that we won't. Quite when it will level off, whether it will actually get to 85% by 2034, it's impossible to say, but I'm just urging caution in assuming that it will continue to grow at its recent rate. I hope that answers that question.
Mr. Robson, do you want to put your mic on?
You missed me complimenting your fulsome answer, Mr. Mitchell. The next phrase is practical capacity, which is the number of cremations that can be taken on through a facility on the number of slots available. And it's in the statement of common ground that 80% of practical capacity. Above that figure makes it more difficult to achieve a qualitative funeral, and that's a point agreed between you and the appellant. No doubt we'll hear something from Mr. Jameson, who I know doesn't agree with that. But Mr. Village in his opening says that you treat the 80% as a target. I just wonder what you say in response to that, and how the inspector should use the 80% practical capacity figure.
I don't use 80% as a target, and I've no recollection of using the word target anywhere in my documents. I refer to it as a recognised threshold, and that it is regarded that if you have a crematorium above that threshold, then yes, the qualitative provision may be compromised. There's two fundamental issues about need. There's quantitative need. You establish how many people are in your area. You look at the capacity at crematoria to cope with numbers of deaths and things like that. But then you have the qualitative factors. There are various of those, such as how long do I have to wait before I can have a funeral? What's the journey time like? What's the journey like? What's the place like when I get there? What's the length of service? There's all sorts of things like that. There's a complex interplay between all of these factors. And it was at the Essington appeal a few years ago that it was agreed that this 80% figure was a recognised threshold. This was endorsed by the Secretary of State, and at that particular appeal, they said, well, it's not just 80%, it's 80% of your practical capacity in a peak month of demand, which is quite a challenging figure to get to. This business about practical capacity relates to the fact that people, generally speaking, prefer a funeral in the middle of the day. This is in everybody's evidence. They don't want to, generally speaking, they prefer not to come at 9 o'clock in the morning in the rush hour to the crematorium. So most people, the evidence demonstrates, prefer core times. There's some disagreement as to what is a core time, but generally accepted that the middle of the day is a preferred core time, and what is your capacity to be able to cope with people wanting to come at those times to your crematoria.
Thank you. So,
sorry, just had to let the dog in the door.
I was going to say, if you're running away at my questions, thank you, Mr. Mitchell. You mentioned there the qualitative factors that also drive people's choice, or also influence people's choice of which crematorium to choose. What is generally considered to be the principal driver in the choice of a crematorium?
Proximity. People generally don't want to, they want to minimise the time it takes to the crematorium. They will choose the closest crematorium to where the deceased live or where the family live. It's actually a very complex situation. So, for example, when I managed Wrexham Crematorium, it's a relatively rural area. There were crematoria to the north and, work it out, east, but not a lot happening in the west. And people were having to drive, if they wanted to attend a funeral service at a crematorium. If their nearest one was me, they'd have to drive. It might take them 2 hours to get there. But that was their choice. That was the closest crematorium. And so it seems to be well established that people prefer to use the closest crematorium, but there are a whole series of factors that might influence them not to go to their nearest crematorium.
Now, you say that the proximity is the principal driver, and the assessments that we will no doubt get to in your evidence and the many tables that are produced are based upon, in large part, those drive time catchments. How then can the inspector take into account the qualitative effects or the qualitative reasons behind people choosing a crematorium?
Can you rephrase that, please?
Yes, of course. So much of your analysis is based upon drive time catchments and proximity as the main driver for choosing your crematorium. There are, of course, other factors to be taken into account, the qualitative factors which you mentioned. How does the inspector, or how do you factor those into your assessment?
I think personally that we're using various techniques to try and understand and quantify human behaviour. And I think it would be very difficult to work out the qualitative factors and somehow put a number, put a calculation against it to work out, yes, this crematorium is the closest for 100,000 people. However, 20,000 of those people, when they need a funeral, they're going to go somewhere else because of qualitative factors. So I don't do that. I recognise it. My view is that you have the population with, a population that's closest to one particular crematorium. As a general rule, they'll use that. The next crematorium further away, that's got a load of people living closest to that who will generally use that. But there will be a flow between the two, or the three, or the four. But I think it'll very often balance out, that some people will prefer the crematorium that's a little bit further away for their particular reasons, others for others. So in my work, I don't attempt to quantify how many people will prefer any given crematorium because it's brand new. I acknowledge that they will, but I don't attempt to quantify that.
One of the ways in which Mr. Best seeks to take into account the qualitative factors is through what he terms as rebalancing. Now, so what is your response to Mr. Best's approach to rebalancing?
I find it very complicated. And as I say, it's an attempt to quantify human behaviour. So I think it's of limited value. Clearly, you build a new crematorium and it has an impact upon people. It becomes a lot of people's closest crematorium, and generally speaking, they will come to it. It may well be that it will attract funerals from well-established crematoria where people are actually closer to the well-established crematorium, but they might prefer to go to the shiny new one for all sorts of reasons. but I think, as I say, I don't attempt to quantify it.
If you could turn up, please, document H11, which is the Secretary of State's decision in the Essington appeal. And ma'am, it's page 63 electronically, 63 of 178. Sorry, no, I should do this document properly. Starting at page 59 of 178. Marked 47 at the bottom centre of the page.
Sorry, for those of us who've got paper copies or other means of reading it, could you just give the paragraph numbers again? I'm so sorry.
Sorry, Mr. Village. Yes, it's from the closing submissions. It's in Appendix D of the inspector's report. Appendix D, closing submissions on behalf of Dignity Funerals Limited. Are you there, ma'am?
Sorry, I'm in the core document. Whereabouts is it in there? Just to
core
confuse
document H11. Are you on an electronic version, ma'am?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, it's on page 60, starting on page 59 of 178 electronically.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but as ever with the number of these documents, I'm having enormous difficulties opening it. Well, I'm not having enormous difficulty, it won't open. Simple as that. I can ask my clients, I think I'll be able to be provided with one. So I don't mean to interrupt, but it's a problem I've had now on a number of occasions with these core documents. I don't know if, Madam, it's your experience. I think Mr. Village had pointed out that he was having difficulties on occasions as well.
Mr. Barrett, I took the liberty of downloading them to my computer just to avoid that problem. So you can kind of WinZip them and download them. Might be worth trying that. Seems to make it a bit easier.
I will. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am. Are you there, ma'am?
I am, yes.
Appendix D, and it's headed the closing submissions on behalf of, Mr. Village. Hello, Mr. Village.
Sorry, no, I don't know whether you gave me a paragraph number, but I think I've lost it if you did.
No, sorry, the specific paragraph we'll go to is paragraph 35 of your closings.
Thank you.
Thank you. So, ma'am, it's headed this closing submissions on behalf of Dignity Funerals Limited. We don't need to go there, but I don't think there'll be any dispute. It was Mr. Village representing Dignity Funerals at that appeal, and it was Mr. Best providing the evidence on need. Page 35, scrolling down to electronic page 53. Electronic page 63, numbered page 51. We get a better explanation there of Mr. Best's methodology than perhaps we do in his proof, which states that he apportions 100% of cremations in that area to a new facility. The methodology then goes on to look at fringe areas. These areas are technically closer to another crematorium by drive time, but remain within 12.9 minutes drive time of the new facility. Given the clear qualitative benefits of the new facility versus those overtrading around it, he apportions 50% of cremations within those areas to the new facility. So that the approach then is to take, because he says one crematorium is better than another, even though the other is closer, 50% of people will choose the new crematorium. In the evidence you've seen to the inquiry, we know that he makes some calculation on rebalancing. Have you seen the 50% figure or other repeated?
I've not.
Now, do you know what basis Mr. Best makes his percentage calculation?
I do not, but I note that he seems to be saying that you build a new crematorium and it will receive 100% of the cremations within its minimum drive time catchment, its natural catchment area. It will receive 100% of those cremations, and it will attract other cremations from beyond its minimum drive time catchment. And I'd like to say I think that's flawed. No crematorium will necessarily receive 100% of the cremations from within its catchment area, because people have a freedom of choice, as we've discussed. And there are all sorts of reasons why, even if you did have a beautiful, well-managed, shiny new crematorium in a location, and it makes perfect sense for everybody to get there because it's their closest crematorium, there are loads of reasons why some people will actually go somewhere else. They have particular reasons, all sorts of reasons. It can be that dad was cremated at, let's say, Rose Hill, for that matter. Dad was cremated at Rose Hill. We want to go there with Mum. In fact, all of our family get cremated there, so we always go to Rose Hill. It can be as simple as that. So I disagree that 100% of the cremations in any crematorium's catchment area, you can just assume you're going to get them. I think there's a give and take. There'll be some that you would attract, whether it's 50% of those in the overlapping area is another matter.